Welcome to My Morning Cup, a podcast produced by Costa Media Advisors and brought to you by the generous support of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To learn more about TVA's impact on our community, follow TVA on Instagram at TVA and on Twitter X at TVA News. My Morning Cup, where we have interesting conversations with genuine people. I'm Mike Costa, your host. My guest this week is Tim Dooner. Dooner is the host and producer of the Freight Waves podcast, What the Truck. It's a podcast dedicated to supply chain and the logistics industry. Dooner, welcome to My Morning Cup.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you for having me. Love the office over here. Love that TVA's involved. People who've been to Chattanooga, or if you're coming out to Chattanooga for one of Freightways conferences, you'd see that TVA is one of our skyscrapers here.
Yeah, it is. They've been great to me. But before we get to our conversation, I do want to find out how old you were when you began growing that awesome beard.
When I began growing, well, okay, so like the first time was probably 2016. I'd grown it like before, off and on before, but I had more corporate jobs, so I couldn't really keep it. Then in 2016, I lost my job, started podcasting, and didn't have anyone to really tell me what to do. So I guess since then, without cutting it.
Isn't that nice? I have been growing this beard about 3 years.
It's getting there. It's incremental, but it's working.
Yeah, it's incremental over here, incremental over there. Do have to ask you the standard first question.
Yeah.
What's in your morning cup?
What is in my morning cup? I try to... Like energy drinks are the bane of my existence. I try to avoid them. Sometimes before like a show, if you really need it, might go with a sugar-free Monster. But I'm a coffee guy. I like black coffee.
Yeah,
maybe a little milk if it's like too hot. Not even for like the taste, in the morning just to cool it down.
Just cool it down.
I usually go with like the Starbucks house blend. When I'm out like ordering, I get like a venti drip.
You mentioned energy drinks, and I'm assuming you're going to drink caffeinated coffee, but you really don't need any energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the ADHD thing, like I'm taking medicine for that, but it helps you focus. Like some coffee in the morning helps me get in the direction I'm going. It calms me down a little bit.
It calms you down. I like that. So you grew up in Needham, Massachusetts?
I did, a suburb of Boston. It's about 20 minutes from downtown Boston. It's connected by the T. I went to school in Boston, so I don't know. I think back to this when I'm a kid because I have kids now, and like Trump worked at McDonald's, and I was thinking, because I was 14, I worked at McDonald's too, and I was thinking back to like going to school, and I'd have to get up at like 5:30 in the morning, go to the commuter line, take the T into West Roxbury, which is about, 20 minutes away. Then I remember coming back, like you'd come back from school, then like 4 o'clock, work a shift at McDonald's from like 4 till 7:30 at night doing homework. I don't know. We grinded back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have siblings?
I do. I got a sister.
Yeah. Older, younger?
She's 2 years older.
Yeah. And what was it like growing up in the Boston area?
So it was weird because when I was my dad is from Brooklyn, my mother is from Dorchester, Massachusetts. So I kind of have like the two enemy lines.
I was going to say Yankees and Red Sox.
My dad's a Yankees fan and my mom is a Red Sox fan. So as a kid, I lived in Staten Island for a little while, like my most formative years. And in the middle of second grade, we moved back I was born in Massachusetts, we moved back to Massachusetts. My dad he was the president of a maritime insurance company called Roanoke Insurance. And they had a big office in New York and a big office in Boston. So we had to move back and forth. But I ended up in Boston from second grade until I go off to college. And it was fine. I think it was a suburb like most people's suburban thing, riding BMX bikes, watching horror movies when you're 10 years old. It was a different time, early 90s.
So mom's a Red Sox fan, dad's a Yankees fan. Where do you fall?
I got screwed so bad. So my first football game I ever went to as a kid was a Jets game, right? And the first baseball game I went to was a Red Sox game. That was fine. But the real screw was like that curse my dad put upon me by making me go see the Jets, especially because I grew up in Massachusetts, in Boston during the Brady Belichick era.
Yeah.
So all my friends are like Patriot fans, and I just got to sit there and take it year after year. But I think it builds character.
So you and I have something in common.
Are you a Jets fan too?
I'm a Jets fan. I lived in New York when the Jets won the Super Bowl. That's a long time ago.
My dad did too. That was before my time.
Long time ago. But my God, have we been punished?
We've been punished. I mean, and to add insult to injury, Belichick was like the coach of the Jets for about 3 seconds of a press conference.
Long enough for him to go, Jets, Patriots, I'm out of here. Yeah.
What was that? One piece of paper. I resign as HC of NYJ. Men of few words, but they're powerful.
He's a charming man too.
He is. Although I don't know, I'm okay with Bill, but his girl's a little young. It's a little creepy. I've seen the pictures. Maybe a little. I don't know.
Well, I think a 50-year age difference is a little problematic.
Your girlfriend could be your great grandchild, but hey, you know what? Bill's living his life.
Yeah.
She's living her life. She's an adult. I can't say they're adults.
Yeah, absolutely. So, high school. What you said you worked through high school. Talk about a little bit of your high school experience, because what I want to get to is where you are today. But all these things form who you were.
Well, I mean, what you'll notice is I move around a lot. Like, I went to a few different primary schools beforehand. For high school, I went to 3 different high schools. I went to Catholic high school for 2 years, and they had debate there in wrestling, and it was great. But then this guy, Brother Cavett, who was my debate coach, he left, and they brought this lady in who had no debate experience, and she was so terrible. She was there my sophomore year, and it soured me on the experience. Plus, it was all boys Catholic school, and I'm turning 16, and I just want to be co-ed school. So then I switched to another school in downtown Boston. I won their creative writing award, but I had some discipline problems, so I got kicked out, and then I went to a different school in Weston, Massachusetts. But I did well every time I went to school. I just had more of a temper back in the day.
Was the Catholic school the Christian Brothers?
It was called Catholic Memorial.
Yeah.
It was in Massachusetts. A lot of Catholic schools up there. Yeah. Big Catholic League's a big thing. Hockey's a big thing up there. Debate was a big thing. It was cool. I really enjoyed it for a while. I wish we never lost that coach.
Yeah, I bet. So bounced around a little bit in high school.
Yeah, we always did well. We were moving forward. But I got used to very quick having to constantly meet new people and be in new environments ever since. I mean, the hardest one, the hard one was second grade, because moving to a new city and a new town, kids can be a lot meaner. So, in a lot of counties are in the town, and the worst time I think you can move is mid-semester, because you can't even be that summer and people forgot. Everyone's only gone for a couple weeks, and you show up and you're the new kid.
Yeah.
So that kind of sucked. But I mean, I got used to it.
Was it the thing that you're the new kid marching in, that you going in the classroom the first time, the teacher brings you up front and says, "Now, class, we want everyone to meet Timothy"?
There was this, for some, we just didn't get along. This guy, I'm not going to say his name, but I'll just call him David. This guy, David, we just did not get along at all. He was a popular kid in town, and initially just wanted to come right at me when I went over to that school. And we fought in the thing. Fortunately, we didn't get suspended. I've gotten suspended before, but fortunately we didn't get suspended for that one. But you back in the day, you go in the field and you fight, and teachers are coming, you run through the woods.
So talk a little bit about bouncing around high school, and what I want to get to is where you eventually go to college, because you went out to California. But what were some of you mentioned McDonald's. What were some of the jobs you had as you were growing up, and what did they teach you?
Sure. I mean, the first one I ever had was caddying, when you're 12 years old.
Yeah.
And there's this place in Newton, and it was a 10 or 12 mile walk. And my buddy and I walked one day to go caddying, and it took forever to get there. Then we caddied all day, and then I decided I hated golf. So I never did golf again, but I did bag boy. I did that for a week. I didn't like it at all. Bag boy. That's why I switched to McDonald's, was there for a few years, became a bus boy, then switched over to being a waiter. Then college comes around.
Yeah. Were those jobs mainly just to make money, or was there any interest in the food industry? Was that
no, it just means to an end, so we could go out to movies. And it's changed now. I guess now a lot of kids don't want to get their car, but back in the day when I was growing up, 16 and a half was a rite of passage. You had to get you were a loser if you. There's even a movie, License to Drive, with Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, about
I remember it.
They're so embarrassed that he fails the test. He just steals his parents' car anyway.
You didn't do that, did you?
No, I know. I was pretty good. I never got arrested or anything.
So you're bouncing around high school, and it's time to go to college, and you go far away. Why did you choose somewhere on the other side of the country?
So initially I didn't. So my first year of college was at the school called Bennington. It's a liberal arts college in Bennington, Vermont, which is It's where Bret Easton Ellis went to. So I knew the book American Psycho. I knew the book's Rules of Attraction. I was interested in that. And also I was really into this band Nine Inch Nails at the time, and I wanted to get into audio production and audio recording. So Bennington happened to have a music technology program. They had like this haunted house looking like movie studio on campus, and it seemed really cool and quiet and great. The problem was it was too small. It was like under 300 people.
Oh, so that's very small.
Yeah, like by a few months in there, you've already made your friends and enemies, and like neither you can really avoid an environment that small. And at the same time, I'd really want to get out to California. Now, like they had a music technology program, but I felt like the people there weren't that ambitious. Like this is just my own naivety, but I'm like, I want to be a rock star. I need to get out to Los Angeles. I need to do this, and this. And when you're 18, you think you're like 35. Like I felt much older when I was younger than I do now because there's all that sort of anxiety about what the future holds and these fake milestones you put in your head about where you need to be at any given time. So I felt the school was too small, but the one nice thing they had was an internship program. So I went out to Los Angeles and I did an internship at a independent record label to sort of learn how the industry worked because I didn't really, I'm like, oh, I work for a record label. Am I going to be recording stuff? Am I going to be doing? But it turned out more like I built their website back in 1998. I sort of learned how albums were put together, how the other side of the business, how bands actually interface with the record industry. And I found it all fascinating. So when I was there, my boss, this great guy, he's still a mentor of mine, very important figure in my life, is a guy named Brian McNellis. He was my boss during the internship, and he told me about the school, California Institute of the Arts, that was up in Valencia, California, and how they had a very good emerging music technology program. So, and I think I think Cal Arts is connected with Disney as well. Tim Burton went there, Pee Wee Herman went there, just a bunch of big names in the industry. So I applied, I went out there, and I was off to California.
Did you always gravitate towards the arts growing up?
Well, it's just like business stuff. Like it just didn't interest me. My dad was a businessman. He was never home. I was a latchkey kid. Not saying my parents were bad. It's like it was the late 80s, early 90s. My parents worked a lot. You had both parents working. By the time you're like 8 years old, you're coming home alone. You're cooking Ilios pizza for yourself and that kind of thing. So I became very independent early on. So the prospect of moving to Los Angeles when I was 19, that
was nothing.
I felt like I was already too old. I should have gone a year earlier.
Yeah. You mentioned you want to be a rock star. So do you play?
So I was more like, if you're familiar with Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor, he's sort of like one man sort of production thing. So my goal at the time, especially with the emergence of electronic and everything that was going on, like I had a Kurzweil K2500 keyboard. It was like my prized possession for graduating high school with a sampler. But I was really into the sequencing and the recording and bringing all the instruments in and sampling and that kind of stuff. Myself, I can barely, I can step record, but I'm not like a good live musician.
Yeah. Is there, because I hear you say that and I don't know the details of all that, but is that like more on the producer end and be able to put things together like that?
Oh, yeah.
So do you have someone who's like a favorite producer? Like I'm going to say Rick Rubin.
Sure. Trent Reznor.
Trent Reznor. Yeah. Oh, you mentioned
he still is my favorite producer, but he was back then too. And if you remember, like back in the time, especially in the later 90s, like Trent Reznor was cooking. He put out the Downward Spiral, and that genre of music had really taken over. But he'd also got into the mainstream by doing a few soundtracks. He did Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers. He did David Lynch's Lost Highway. And that's really I saw that as a full career. So just from like a business, as a kid, as a young kid, you're like, how do you become a rock star? How do you get sustainable? Is there a business side to it? I'd been in this record label and it was like, okay, the Trent Reznor archetype is what I was like aiming for at the time.
That's got to be a pretty unusual perspective for a young 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid, because most are going to look and just see the flash and the glory.
I think anybody who sort of was interested in music at that time, they started to sort of realize there were producers like Trent Reznor and Dr. Dre who had managed to make themselves much bigger than just sort of like what the band they were by also producing and building up these other acts around them. Like for Nine Inch Nails, you had Marilyn Manson, who was very popular for a time. For Dr. Dre, you had everyone from Snoop Dogg through Eminem that he had put out. So looking at how things were starting to be produced, and especially the direction music was going in, that seemed like the only smart direction for me in music to go towards. So
you go out to California. Talk a little bit about that process of getting out there, and what do you do? I
don't know. So, I had a roommate at first, and this guy Jonathan Covert, he was really cool. He was really into like film and special effects and makeup, and was already like more ambitious than, at least in terms of like where they wanted to be in media and how soon they wanted to make an impact in Los Angeles or Hollywood. He was like way ahead. So he was a big inspiration at first. And it was cool. The only problem was like the taste of being at that record label and actually like operating and being in the business and being out at the clubs and meeting people seems so much more impactful to me than any day that like I was in school in the studio. So I never even graduated college. I only lasted 2 years. I eventually ended up taking a job with Brian. I called him up and I was like, I've done this for 2 years now, but like, I want to work. Like, I don't feel like I'm learning anything doing these projects. And, we're spending like $20,000-$30,000 a year. So he gave me a job and I started out immediately doing A&R, which is a really cool job
Explain what A&R does.
So artisan repertoire, it goes back to like the beginnings of the record industry. Back in the day, you would take standard songs, public domain songs, Yankee do whatever it was, and they would pair that with an artist, and that was the initial song and artist. That's the beginnings of A&R. It was really until the Beatles came around, where they started writing their own songs, that A&R was more about sort of finding the band, and producers came more about bringing the sound together. But for a long time, the A&R was kind of like that head producer. By the time I got into it, it was more like, we're going to find all the cool like indie rock bands and indie goth and punk and industrial, all the sort of niche bands. We were independent labels. So that's what we focused on. And go to clubs, we'd meet people. And one of the coolest things, but one of the most sobering things that I learned early on in the industry was, this was the early 2000s I was there. And if you recall, rock music got killed by alternative music, right? Nirvana and grunge came around, then alternative, industrial, and then new metal. So rock never really grew back up. So now it has. You've had the nostalgia tours, but that hadn't really cashed in. So you'd have all these guys from like Poison and ex-members of Guns N' Roses and ex-member of Motley Crue, and they would be doing these tribute albums for like $500 or less to sing on a song, you know? And it was really, really eye-opening. Yeah. I'm so glad I got that business perspective of it, because it let you see what the industry was and wasn't. And when you really want something, like you really want to, you tend to ignore all the bad side and the pratfalls, because there's only one way through, and it's through that wall. And that was still my goal, but it was really interesting to just to see that the careers are fragile. The industry's fragile. The trends are fragile. And a lot of what you see, especially a lot of like famous people, a lot of stuff sort of like rented, and the airs are put on and things look good in the music video. But in reality, this guy's living, like, I'm barely making over $20,000 a year. It's my first job in A&R. And like, this guy was a world famous rock star a couple of years ago, and he's making less than money than me, living in a smaller apartment in Hollywood. That
had to have a tremendous effect on you.
It did.
In terms of perspective, because it, as you said, if someone wants something so much, they don't really see the downsides of it. But you're able, at what, 21 years old, to go, wait a second, this guy was touring the world 5 years ago, and I'm lending him $10 for a McDonald's.
The other bad side of it too is, this is the same time in the industry that Napster had really taken off, and LimeWire, and really sort of transformable way the industry had done. I think it was 1998 or 1999, CD sales had peaked. Like, the industry was on a high, but it was so obvious to, and especially me in college who was using Napster. And I would say this at work, and I'd be like, look, I can go home, and the only thing that is protecting our catalog is some of it's just too obscure for anyone to have actually uploaded it right now. But if you go on here, look at all these songs that are on here. We have to figure out a way to address these big changes. And I don't know if that's putting out some MP3s for free so people can get introduced to our bands, but we have to figure out a way of this massively changing, massively emerging market. And that's what also made the music industry so hard, and why after a few years I just became disillusioned, because you would see those guys and things would be, and your tributes would be offering less and less. And it just seemed like there was no way forward. For a couple of years, it was like, okay, I can make $20,000. I can live off like ramen noodles and macaroni and cheese and vodka. And, you know, I'm young and it's fine. And we're in Hollywood, and I get to go to clubs for free, and it's cool enough. But over a little bit of time, by like 25, I was just like, man, I don't see the around the bend.
Yeah, you don't see the future quite the way, because as you said, you're 21, you're going to clubs, you're living that lifestyle. It was all great.
After a couple of years, though, you
burn out
because you never get anywhere. There's never like any money in the bank, and anytime like you do pick something up, then you get a flat tire or something, and it's just that really early struggle of the 20s. The only cool part is like you're like bulletproof for a while.
Yeah. So what was that realization, and what did you do after that? I mean, you're 25 and you go, yeah, I got to figure something out.
I mean, in your memory, everything sort of like happens quick, but there was a full like transition year of me leaving the record label, me having no idea what to do in Los Angeles. I was in a bad relationship with a girl living in her apartment, and fortunately, my parents, they had just decided to move down to Dana Point, and they'd called me a few weeks earlier, and they're like, hey, we got an extra space in there. If you ever want to come down, stay for a while, feel free. And I was like, okay, great. Won't need it. Things are going great, you know, trying to put the illusion out there. But
I'm building my life. Thank you.
Then there was just one night, wasn't making any money, was done with Hollywood, and got in an argument with that girl where it broke up, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go regroup. I got this landing. Like, how often you get, like, I need this lifeline. They have this lifeline. So I moved back with my parents for about 11 months when I was 25. And I got a job as a waiter, and I went to this school called Saddleback College. I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought I was going to be like maybe a teacher or something. I wasn't sure. So I was getting because I went to art school. So I had to get like some math requirements and stuff like that. And I was working on it for a little bit. But then after a year, a buddy of mine in Boston calls up and he's like, hey, I got a room open up in my apartment. It's $500 a month. My lease was just coming up on my car. I was sick of living at my parents' house. Felt like a total failure. To me, again, like 24, 25, I felt like I was 35 or 45 or something. You know, I just felt like I was going nowhere.
Yeah.
So moved back to Boston, and there was a company, Rock Band, another video game comes into my life. Rock Band was based in Cambridge, and I felt where I'd worked in the music industry, I could go to a company like Harmonix and be like, well, I've been on the A&R side. We've licensed a lot of tracks before. I understand the entire process. Unfortunately, they didn't hire me. It took after about 3 months, I had no job, and contacted my dad, and he was just like, hey, I know a guy at a freight forwarder called FedEx Trade Networks. This guy, Bob Keneally, if you go talk to him. And I thought I'd be there for 3 months.
Yeah.
Went down there. I didn't even have a car in Boston. I had to take the red line to the orange line to the blue line, then walk a mile across a damn drawbridge to get over there. But I went, and he offered me the job. I didn't know what a customs broker is. I didn't know what a freight broker is. I didn't know how import entries worked or anything. But it was a job. It got my parents off my ass, and it was something to do. And then I'm still in the industry. I thought I'd be out. Honestly, I thought I'd be out by spring.
So when you were working at McDonald's in high school, you weren't thinking, man, if I could just get into the freight industry, I'll have it made?
No, I was listening to a Discman with Broken by Nine Inch Nails, dreaming about getting to Los Angeles.
So you get into the freight industry, and you don't think you're going to be there very long. You're in Boston.
Yeah.
Where's that take you?
To East Boston for a long time. I was at FedEx Trade Networks for years. One of the reasons I think I stayed so long, and it's a story that led to the biggest sort of transformation a little bit later in my life, was I had a problem with drinking for a long time. So I sort of found that comfortable job at FedEx. I knew what I had to do every day, got stuck in that routine of drinking a bottle of Smirnoff sort of every single day. And that was the life, every night, go to bed, get to work, get drunk to get that hangover off. You're feeling good again. The next thing you know, it's 1 a.m. and then so you go back to sleep. I did that for freaking years before going to rehab for the first time.
How old were you going through this? Late 20s?
Yeah, so I was mid-20s and by the time right before I turned 30, I went to rehab for the first time for drinking because it had just gotten so bad. But my issue was I was dating this girl at the time, and I had this idea in my head that if I go 90 days, I didn't have a problem. Because if you can control it for 90 days, you don't have a problem. So obviously after 90 days, we got back into it, and then it would be years again before I'd go back to rehab. But the problem would just sort of escalate and build. Was
this a problem that you recognized and addressed, or did people who loved you have to come to you and say, Tim?
No, I eventually, people knew and people were aware. I never had sort of an intervention thing, but I had many sort of late nights where you know what you're doing is wrong. You have to change this. You have to get on the other path. And there's this big sort of depression, anxiety that sets in along with that. And this cycle just really kept repeating. I couldn't break myself out of it. So
your late 20s, early 30s, how do you get through that then? I mean, because that's hard, as you're saying. It's anxiety, it's depression, it's everything.
And I was able to for a while, but what happened is I switched over to the sales side of the business, and my job started getting more sporadic. Sales already can be erratic enough. The first one I was at for about 2 years, and then that didn't work out. I switched to another one. I was at this company for about 9 months, and my wife got pregnant right at the start of my job there. And first month went really well. Sales were going good. Then the market just sort of tanked. Yeah. And I found my wife away at work and myself home alone many days. And that's when the drinking this was 2016. That's when the drinking started to get really, really bad again. And my second son was on the way. And I wanted to start a podcast at this job, at this freight job, because I thought it'd be a good way to introduce people. And they were like, no, that's stupid. And you're not selling anything. You're fired. Wow. It was at the beginning of November. My kid was born at the end of November, but I had a little free time, and fortunately they kept our health insurance active for the end of the month. So for the first week of being laid off, I was just getting hammered. And then I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And I scared myself because I was sort of happy when I got fired. I'm like, oh, now I have all this free time to get. And I'm like, I have another kid on the way. Yeah. You got to get your head together and in the game. So I called that guy, Brian McNellis, from all the way back in the day, because I know he dealt with similar problems. And I emailed him in the middle of the night, and I was like, hey, I got to get myself into rehab. And if I don't, here's a number for my mom and my wife and my sister, and call them up and force them. because I was really drunk, like in the morning when I wrote that. But it worked, and I told my wife and everything, and we went the next day, and then I went to rehab in a dual diagnosis facility, and it completely changed my life.
It's got to. I'm listening to you, and I'm going. You had to be mature beyond your years, because at that age, so many people just maintain denial that you're able to see that yourself.
I mean, the problem was there was just no way forward. Like in my head, it was like this, the only path forward is death. Like if you keep doing this, like,
but you were able to see that, I guess is what I'm saying. Cause a lot of people wouldn't even see that.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I saw it sooner, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but you did see it.
Eventually.
You addressed it. So how long did it take you to go through rehab and get it to a place where you felt comfortable?
I went on a weekend. So when you go on a weekend, you end up having to stay longer. Like usually it's only supposed to be 5 days, but I ended up being there 7 days.
Yeah.
By the way, if you ever go to rehab, bring shower shoes. There's a lot of stuff I didn't know to bring with me. You don't want to go barefoot in the shower and all there. The other bad thing about rehab is the people who are on opiates. Oh my God, they come in terrible, like screaming.
Oh yeah.
If you ever want to get someone to not do like opiates or heroin or Oxycontin or anything, bring them into a rehab, especially at nighttime when they intake those people. They are in pain. They are just screaming and crazy, and they get violent, and it's not cool.
Wow, that had to. Well, that obviously formed you. I mean, that is a formative period. How old were you when you got out clean and sober, and what'd you do next?
So this was in 2016. So I was 37, and we just had our second kid. Our second kid was just born at the end of that month. And when I was at that meeting, I had a therapist, and one of the things they were like, "Well, what are you going to do afterwards?" And I liked that podcast idea I had when I was at the other company, and I was like, "Well, I want to do this podcast, and I don't think our industry has any that sound like actual podcasts. We have things that sound like stripped audio from webinar, but I think that we could sort of do what the Bill Simmons and the Joe Rogans of the world are doing and make things sound a little bit more conversational and more like the conversations at, like in my industry, that people would have at a conference off stage versus the very prepared, fake, buzzwordy stuff you hear on stage, because that's what my industry was doing. And I felt like maybe it could be like our living resume. So I just started the podcast. We have this brand new kid, and it ended up being such a blessing. Like, I'm glad it took a while. That first year took a while, because I got that entire year with my newborn. And my wife still had her job, so she was able to work and stuff. I mean, it was really, really tough first year.
Yeah, I bet.
But it was also so amazing. And like, you don't need that much money when you're sitting home with like a baby, you know, like a little Sebastian just sitting on me all the time, taking naps together. And we're still so close, me and my kid. Like, so, I mean, I would do that all over again. It was scary though during it, because I was getting jobs during the time, but a few were in sales, and I didn't want to do that again. I felt like I'd relapse, and I'd done that 2 years in a row and failed, or 3 years in a row and failed with 2 different companies. So I wanted to get into marketing, or at least back into operations. I didn't think podcasting would be a career. Like, I honestly just thought like the podcast was just a means to getting a marketing job. And initially it did. This guy, Steve Aborn, who runs a company called Freight Plus, he was a town over, and he started hearing the show, and he was like, well, we need some blogs on our site. So he initially hired me to ghostwrite some blogs. So check one. Initially want to get some freelance marketing work out of this. Got it relatively quick after the launch of the show. And I kept developing the relationship with Steve. And over time, he hired me to be their director of marketing and to launch a podcast for them and to do their show. And then after a little while of doing their podcast, I interviewed Chattanooga local, former guest of this show, Mr. Craig Fuller.
Yeah. Make sure I understand. You started podcasting about the freight industry.
Yeah.
While you had your second kid, you were laid off, you weren't working.
I was unemployed, just working freelance.
What was the name of the podcast?
The Shipping Pod.
And what would you focus on? Would you have guests?
So I initially had a co-host. So for the first 9 episodes, I had my buddy Ryan Dooley from Weymouth, Massachusetts, and we would do the shows. And then we did one on human trafficking. I think it was like episode 9. And I think he maybe thought it was like too heavy or something, because he bailed. Yeah. So I lost my co-host. And then I could have just ended it there. And I'm sure a lot of people would. Wasn't making money. It's, oddly enough, though, we started getting some traction. And even now it was pretty good track. It was like 1,000+ downloads per episode, which
That's
in
great.
freight podcasting is pretty damn good. Like,
Yeah.
just for starting out too. So I knew it was working, so I stuck with it. So I'm like, all right, maybe I'll switch to guests. And my dad had worked in the industry for a long time, and who easier than like, you're selling something, you do anything, approach family.
Yeah.
So I'm like, Dad, come on the show. Tell me a story about, how maritime freight insurance works and your career throughout there. And that's what I started with.
So you're doing that, and that gets you attention and into marketing and your connection to Chattanooga, you interviewed Craig Fuller.
Yeah, I didn't know it from Timbuktu, but what I did know is when I was writing all those ghost blogs, I would have to, and writing their newsletter, a lot of it was to aggregate freight news. So I'd have to Google supply chain news, freight news, supply chain tech news. And I noticed in 2017, this one website, FreightWaves, kept showing up more and more often in my search results. And I hadn't heard of them before because I think they'd only started that year. And they just kept growing and growing. And I know that they did a conference. It was called Market Waves. And in my industry, all the conferences, like they were lit like this room. Now there's anything wrong with this room, but the entire event, like there's no style, there's no like sort of verve. It's very overhead office.
There's no showbiz.
Lighting. Yeah. So I saw their event and it reminded me of this event that HubSpot throws on in Massachusetts at the convention center, where they had floor lighting and colored blue lights and purple lights and LEDs everywhere and sculptures and stuff like that. So there's a lot more like, oh, this looks cool. So they were going that direction and it matched very well. So I knew I had to get on their radar. And Craig was out promoting freight futures, which was a way to hedge the freight market. And I knew he'd probably have to promote it. So I'm like, okay, our podcast is probably pretty small, but and to me, when you're looking online, I don't realize it's like a company of like 15 people at the time. To you, it's like, I don't know, it could be a massive entity. Who knows? So I asked him if he'd come on and do the show. And he did, and I interviewed him. And what's funny, and you might appreciate this from the production side, is I sent him like a link, like a VoIP link, and we're supposed to connect, and he's supposed to come on. Well, what happens is the show comes, and it turns out he's on a cell phone. I'm relatively new at podcasting. I hadn't prepared for this. I didn't even have a road board. My board had a USB, but it was a Mackie with a USB. And I'm almost like, I can't do it. But something in my head was like, you absolutely have to do this. So quick thinking, I had a 1-800 conference call number I'd used before with a previous guest. And I used that. So Craig recorded completely on that. We both recorded on that. And then I edited out all of my answers and responses from that conference call thing. So I used his audio and then I just like re-record all my questions on it and then improved the audio. And then a couple days later, it came out and he was like, that was incredible. I love the interview. We're launching a podcast and TV studio down here in Chattanooga. If you ever want a job, feel free to come down. And I was like, I didn't know. I'm from the Northeast. I didn't know Chattanooga from Timbuktu. Like somewhere in Tennessee, but I didn't know I went down there. My wife's a triplet. All of our families are up in the Northeast area. So this could be a hard ask. But fortunately, my wife, she was kind of against it at first, but I took her out here. We stayed in the Bluffview Art District. Yeah. But it helped sell her. She saw it. She didn't realize this city was so kid friendly. We got the aquarium here. We have the zoo. We've got a few parks. We've got the carousel. Atlanta, Nashville, so close. So we came down. We walked around a bunch and ended up finding a place on 5 Points. It had just that building. I was actually the first resident. I got pre-COVID a year early because no one else lived there. So weird because you'd have the pool to yourself. You'd have the which was nice, but a little weird at the same time.
It's kind of like The Shining.
Yeah, it was kind of like The Shining.
Yeah. So that gets you to Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And explain a little bit for the folks who may not know what FreightWaves does today.
Sure. So FreightWaves it's two things. It's a data platform. So the data platform takes shipping data from trucks, from planes, from rail, from ocean vessels, all that kind of thing. And it helps the market navigate and chart their course for how pricing and things like that are going to go. The other side that I work on is the media side, where we have a huge editorial team that covers FreightWaves from a written perspective. We have a multimedia team like myself who launches shows. I have FreightWaves' longest running show, What the Truck, which is also a podcast. That initially started out as audio only. I remember starting the studio, I was the first one to stick my hand up, put a camera in the booth. Let me be your test monkey. Let's put a camera in there. It was once a week. I expanded it over to 2 days a week, then to 3 days a week. And then this year, SiriusXM picked us up and syndicated the show. So 3 days a week, we're also on SiriusXM.
Well, that's really big. And go back to what the truck started. You obviously, Craig was on your podcast, but my experience with FreightWaves and Craig is he's always open to ideas, and particularly good ideas that stick. That did it surprise you when you started it, how it caught on?
No. So I had a very unwavering belief in what we could do and what we could accomplish and what we could make viable. Because I'd already done this on the indie side, and I'm like, with FreightWaves backing, this will be a lot easier because we actually have the studio and the team. And my focus now is completely on that versus when I was a marketing director, I also had to do like RFPs and, pricing requests and proposals and decks and stuff like that. So I felt like it would work right away. And Craig is an interesting guy because Craig, he'll say what he wants done, but he's not going to tell you how to do it or what to do. He's going to be like, okay, we built the studio, like let's do some stuff. That's why we hired you, which I find really freeing. And it's interesting because at Freightwaves, we've had a lot of success by bringing people in who've been from the industry, right? Because they sort of understand what they're talking about. They can translate. But sometimes that backfires because sometimes you get people on the brokerage side who are very used to their day being like, they know how many shipments they're going to handle. And like, work is constantly delegated to them. So and that kind of person can be tougher in a startup because in a startup, it's like, here's nothing, go do something and come back with something, in 6 months. It's not, here's a file, like bring this to the next stage kind of a situation.
Well, I think that's a really important point because to what you said, someone who's got a very structured day, I know how many calls I got to make. I know how many this, and you go put yourself in a atmosphere like Freightwaves where Craig is very much like, okay, I've got all the things here necessary to bake a cake.
Yeah.
Go bake the cake. And a lot of people don't have that initiative.
The one thing that has made it very easy for me to communicate with Craig is I'm not afraid. Like he's a person who recruited me. I've been talking to him my entire career with the company. I've noticed that some people, they struggle more when they don't though. Like they don't know how to communicate with him. They're like afraid to communicate. So not as much can get done. Where with someone like him, like he really likes when people are like, oh, I had this great idea. And you just, sort of text it to him. Like, what do you think? Or he'll be like, I had this amazing idea. Can you like iterate upon it? He's very good that way. And he's very into freight where I am too. So you can have that sort of casual conversation with your boss about how things are functioning or if the freight recession is over and what the feedback is going to be online and those kind of things. That's one of the things I like about Craig. He gets so freaking passionate about the world that I work in.
Yeah. When What the Truck started, what year was that? 17, did you say?
I got over there in 2019.
2019. So did it catch on as quickly as you thought it would?
So when I got there, they already had 65 episodes and 2 different hosts. This guy, JP and Chad, and it was audio only.
It was called What the Truck?
It was called What the Truck. Yes,
I didn't realize that. I thought you brought that.
No, so they were starting they had started running. There were about 65 episodes in, but it hadn't really taken off. My other show, Consulting Logistics, was actually beating it on the indie side. And when I first came in, before we really sort of knew what to do, this guy, JP, he wanted to transition out more into writing. So I just jumped into the seat and What the Truck. And what I learned very quickly from my co-host Chad at the time was that he didn't care as much about the production side of it. So I was very quickly able to take over the show and restructure it how I wanted and make it into the thing I wanted it to be. It used to be like the podcasts were like, at the start, they'd be like, I'm drinking this beer and I'm drinking this beer. And, people would ramble and it wasn't very, it didn't have much of a direction to it. And when I came in, I changed the focus completely. And I'm like, okay, we're going to be a news and interview magazine style show. And this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to have this many guests. And then when COVID happened, that really opened it up. Because initially I'd used a lot of internal or only local guests. But then once COVID happened, everybody in my industry figured out how to connect a webcam. Yeah. So that like really opened up the guest pool.
So you could get anyone at any time. And the other thing I noticed, Dooner, is that your show is a product of how you grew up. And what I mean by that, you mentioned Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails. I see you've got the wrestling hat on.
Sure.
You bring a lot of pop culture to it.
Yeah.
And how does that make a difference in it?
Well, I've always thought that freight was way too stiff. Like compared to the people actually working it versus like there's a corporate side that can be very stiff, but in general, it's not that buttoned up of a world. And it's a world with other interests than literally just a truck. And podcasts also have to personify things a little bit. So I've always sort of put the kind of things that I'm interested in and tried to blend them a little bit with what I think the audience would be interested in. And I grew up on wrestling, and I've always thought like wrestling was live production, and it's some of the most amazing live production that ever happened. So, I mean, I think they blow a lot of concerts away and what they're capable of doing. The amount of stories are out, like what WWE can do, the amount of stories and the pyro and how they're able to, and like go to one of their events, you'll see the audience get into it, and that's like the kind of passion industry. I'm like, can we bring that to freight?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the other example of that Freightwaves has done really well is the annual, is it F1,
F3, yeah.
F3. I mean, you go to a freight conference, it's now a rock show.
STP is at the one this year, Stone Temple Pilots.
Are they really?
Yeah, they're playing on, I haven't been to we used to do it at the You know the college, the pavilion center they have over there? I think it's called the First Horizon Pavilion over at Chattanooga. This year we're doing it at Signal, maybe? Is it called Signal? Do we have a
Signal?
rock? Yeah, that's what we're
the
doing
Signal's so Stone Temple Pilots?
Just for the rock show. So we take over the whole town at this event, and we go to all different places. But for the actual concert, I think it's going to be at Signal.
And just give a little more detail on how those started and what they were meant to do.
So what happened was right before the pandemic, we were doing our annual events, and we had one that was coming up in Atlanta, which is our spring event, and we still always do our spring event. And we're thinking of a way of how do we leverage Freight Alley? How do we leverage Chattanooga? There's so many companies over here, so they're probably willing sponsors to bring the industry to Chattanooga, and it's a business. That's always the first thought. It's like, okay, would the community appreciate us bringing something in here? And then it was like, okay, yes, okay, we can make it viable. How do we make it cool? And our idea was the stage stuff at conferences are great, but everyone also wants time to network. So we're like, let's do a show that goes about 8 to 3:30. And the entire rest of the night are pre-planned events around the city. So you get to hear the impactful stuff on stage. You get the chance to sell at your booth and everything. But then for the rest of the time, you're in this sort of captive camp group with all the other freight industries. You can be talking at a concert. You could be when you're at axe throwing. I don't know if the axe throwing place is still around.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Downtown Chattanooga, you never know with. But we had axe throwing before this. The tons of different bars. State of Confusion has happy hours going on. So we really just like to take over the whole city. We show off Freight Alley. We show off Freightwaves headquarters. We show off the convention center. They're closing the Walking Street Bridge.
Yeah.
We're going to have a big happy hour event on that one night of our thing too. So we have the aquarium. We have a reception at the aquarium. And then right afterwards, the Market Street Bridge, we're putting a bunch of, I think, like vendors and drinks and food and stuff on there. And you can hang out on the bridge.
So you're really championing
Chattanooga, yeah. So we really want to showcase Chattanooga and just make it a different experience than where, you just go into a convention and you're in that hotel for 3 days and it doesn't matter where you were, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't sort of like matter who you met and all blends together. We want to put memories here.
Well, and it's really helped build Chattanooga's freight credibility as an epicenter.
I think so. Like, I think Craig understands that if you really want to call this place Freight Alley, you have to help build that. You have to help continue building that. You have giant competition in places like Chicago, places like Los Angeles, places like New York, in this battle for relevancy. If you really want Chattanooga to stay relevant, you got to keep rowing that boat. And I think F3 is a motor on the back of that.
And you guys were blowing and going, and then the recession hits. How's that? Not the recession, COVID hits.
Yeah. So COVID was all right. Like COVID was a big boon because we were able to turn everything virtually. And because we already had that studio, we were able to do it very quickly. Our event that was coming up, we had that spring one that we had to cancel like a month and a half before it happened.
Yeah.
We rolled it into virtual and it was incredibly successful. It did really, really well. The problem was that after about 9-10 months, people got very sort of sick of virtual events. Yep. People wanted, it just became white noise and it became very, very boring. But at the start of the pandemic, that was great. And through the pandemic, it was great. But then in our industry, in April or March of 2022, that freight recession hit. And supply chains are interconnected. When they're doing well, all these companies do well. People want to invest. People start buying trucks. Everything builds up. And then too many people invest and too many people build up. And it all collapses. And that's sort of where we've been in that cycle. And even for a company like Freightwaves, we're not immune. We had to be defensive for a while because these people buy seats on our Sonar platform. They sponsor our show. Like in 2023, a lot of my sponsorships got drawn down a lot because that's where companies have to find money from.
Yeah.
The fortunate thing is we knew it was temporary. There's cycles in this market, and it's drawn down a little bit. So, okay. But now we know what we got to do the next year. And this year we had a different strategy too, which was we knew we had to get those advertising numbers back up where they need to be. But we also figured out some ways that we could partner with teams to get them. A lot of people were offering them like, oh, we'll come to your conference or do this. Where I started offering them was I would start going to their private events. And we would start helping cover that and give ad value to their clients and everything. And I find it really cool because on the production side, you get to work a lot more closely with the parties that are involved.
You guys were able to pivot through that and have officially called an end to the freight recession.
Yeah, Craig Fuller did. I remember I was sitting at my desk the other day and he came over super happy and he's like, we got to turn the cameras on and go on air. And I think the freight recession is dead. And I was like, all right, get on the studio floor.
Well, and that's the beauty of what you're doing. You can do that at the drop of a hat.
I mean, that's why I work for the guy. Like, I like that he has that sort of spontaneous energy. He has that sort of instinct and his urgency is based upon that instinct. And in media, that's crucial. It's like, this is a good idea. And like ideas they come because you hear the ground rumbling, right? You hear the audience or other people talking, and that's what sort of feeds the idea. And you can tell that everyone's going to be red pilled by this pretty soon. And Craig's very smart about getting ahead of all that stuff.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions for you before we run out of time. And one of them is, you've done a TEDx. Talk about that. Talk what you talked about in that experience.
That was really cool. That was a great experience. So Chattanooga was bringing TEDx to town, and this was actually the year of the pandemic. It was 2020. And but that was kind of that was bittersweet. So we didn't get to do it on a TEDx stage, but we all had to record it in our own stages. So my entire thing was on going through rehab and the power of podcasting and finding other ways to redirect negative energy into something positive, becoming addicted to something positive like I did with that. And we got to record it in the studio that I had helped build out at Freightways, at Freight Alley at F3.
Was that a bit cathartic to be able to do that?
It was. Although I always find it weirder to talk to like an empty room than to talk to an audience, because you don't get feedback for like you can't get, like I have to do my show a lot of times too, just like in an empty room. And Craig just said recently, we're bringing some workers back in and they're going to be like near the studio. Will you be bothered by them? I'm like, as long as they're not bothered by me, I like things to interact with. I like to see it. I'm sure you've had this too. You ever just sort of talk alone and then like after 2.5 minutes into it, you're like, am I still on the same road? Like, where am I going?
It's hard without an audience response or someone's response, because you don't know if what you're saying is landing or just being like ignored.
Well, I mean, I thought it was important to do that TEDx as well, to sort of talk about, I mean, one of the reasons I was emboldened to do it was I had a boss who had gotten sober and had told me that and had emboldened me that, okay, it's cool to be public with this kind of stuff. And only is it cool to be like, him doing it is why I went. So now I have to. Like, you have to pay it forward. You have to do this kind of thing, because maybe it will inspire someone. If it inspires someone, then it's great. And I know that it does, because I get DMs all the time from people who've listened to it.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when we had Craig on the podcast, he talked very much about his journey, and you're talking about your journey.
Yeah.
And I think when people don't know you or Craig and only know Freight Waves or anyone, and they don't know, the struggle, or what we were talking about earlier, how careers aren't just a straight up. I've been knocked back quite a few times, and I've had to pick myself and bring myself up. That's the inspirational, and that's where people know that there's something more in there.
I mean, I tend to, we can smell our own. Like, I tend to gravitate towards like the guys who had a little bit of struggle and they had to have the redemption arc, and now like they're sober. Sober guys are former alcoholics, sober ones. Guys are great because they're crazy. Like, they have all this like kinetic energy they got to do something with, and they tend to be like incredibly productive a lot of times.
Yeah.
Because they're kind of like, they have to do anything but feed that beast that's calling out, that alcoholism, that disease that yells to you.
Something has to occupy the mind and the interest.
Yeah, like you can be binary with it, but something else has to be turned on in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense. Before I get to the last question, I want to remind our listeners who makes all this possible, and it's thank you to the Tennessee Valley Authority for sponsoring My Morning Cup. Follow TVA on social media to learn more about its multifaceted mission of service, and visit TVA.com/do good here to explore exciting TVA career opportunities. All right, my standard last question for you, Dooner, is what would you tell that 25-year-old Tim Dooner is important for a happy life?
Rehab, for one. Rehab, definitely. I would tell the 25-year-old me that, because even when I was 25, I knew at some point I wanted to get married and have kids. I thought that would eventually be important at some point. And my wife and my kids are the most important thing in the world to me. So that absolutely was true. So I would tell 25-year-old self to mostly stay the course, but just get in rehab sooner. You don't need the drinking. You're much more powerful. You're much more productive. You're much smarter. You're a much better networker, and you don't destroy relationships when you're sober.
And that's such an important point, because I think drinking being so social, and when you get to my age, I'm 62, that it wears on you. It really wears on you. And as a lot of people I know who've gotten to my age have really cut back or quit.
Yeah,
totally. But that social aspect, so many people think I can't be myself unless I'm drinking, and that's probably the furthest thing from the truth.
Last event I was at, it was in Atlanta, and I was talking to a bunch of guys there, and they were all like, they're all hippies again, man. All these guys are like, we switched to like CBD or Snapdragon or THC, because it doesn't, young people too. Like, and I don't necessarily, people want to feel good and they want to feel comfortable. But yeah, I mean, a lot of young people, a lot of older people are starting to just reject alcohol completely.
Yeah, it just tears you up.
It does. It's not good.
No, not at all. Well, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to do it. I really admire what you're doing. What the Truck, if anyone, if you want to check it out, where can they find it?
Sure. It's live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on FreightWaves social media at noon Eastern time, on demand, podcast players anywhere, or FreightWaves YouTube. Just look up What the Truck, or you can listen to it on radio on SiriusXM's Road Dog Trucking Channel 146 at 5 and 11 p.m. Eastern on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
Channel 146. I'll check it out.
146.
Well, Dooner, good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to My Morning Cup, a podcast by Costa Media Advisors. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. I release a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.